Okay, great. I want to welcome everybody here today. I'm Kathy Moxon, and I'm here with Kim Finney, and we're from Rural Youth Catalyst. We're here with our guest, Mara Tieken, and we're here to talk about rural school closures. And I'll just say a couple housekeeping things. One is that we will hopefully have time for questions. And if you would put those in the chat, we'll try to proctor those so that Mara can get a chance to answer those. And then we are recording this, so we'll make this recording available to people. We only have an hour, and so we're going to try to get right tomorrow. But first, I just want to say one thing about rural schools. When my son was old enough to enter school, there were 34 kids in his school. And I felt compelled when 10% of the school population lived at my house that I had to get on the school board. And I stayed on that school board for 30 years and left that school board when my grandkids started school there. So I have a fondness for rural schools and know the importance they play in building the community where that school is located for my children and their children. So I think this is a great topic. I'm going to turn this over to Kim, and she can introduce Mara.
So Mara, we want to say a huge thank you for joining us. You get Kathy and I in, everyone, you get us in stereo today because we are talking to you from West Virginia, where we are doing some work this week. So we are thrilled to have you all join us. We made the choice in the last few days to switch this to a regular Zoom meeting format versus a webinar format. So that it just because it makes it a little more personal, you can actually, Mara can get to see you. There can actually be like exchange of conversation in a way that the webinar format is much more listening and only a sort of dropping into the written question piece. So we're thrilled to have you. And without further ado, Mara, just a quick introduction. We've been thrilled to get to work with Mara over the last couple of years. She's a member of our Rural Youth Wellbeing Policy Working Group. But more importantly, Mara's research, I have this old copy on my bookshelf that goes all the way back to a chapter she wrote from a match on dry grass. And I was like, this is the Holy Grail. This is amazing. So some of you may be familiar with that book. I came about it at the time that I was sitting on our school board and in our local community and dealing with school closures and consolidation issues. So that was my first introduction to Mara's research. Mara's gone on to write the book you may all know, Why Rural Schools Matter. Her research focuses on racial and educational equity in rural schools and communities. She has a new book coming out in this spring, right? And with incredible study she's been doing on how rural students navigate elite colleges and what it costs them, and amongst many other pieces of work. She's also the associate professor of education at the fabulous Bates College. Yes, let me give a shout out for that. And without further ado, Mara, thanks for joining us. And thank you everyone for taking time out of your day to join us.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. I appreciate it. And for those of you that might not know, Kim is an alum of Bates College. So, but I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Can y'all see that? Okay. Wonderful. As Kim mentioned, today I'm going to be talking about rural school closures and how we can effectively fight them. And I'm particularly interested in the kinds of closures that disproportionately impact poor rural communities and rural communities of color. And so that's what much of what I'll be focused on. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we know about rural school closures and their impacts based on like the larger research. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about my research on rural school closures and how they're shaping Black communities in the Arkansas Delta. And then we should have plenty of time for us to look together at an online toolkit that I've been developing with some folks down in Arkansas that gives strategies and tools and ideas for how to fight closure. Or if you get to the point of having to close your school, how to do it well. But so just to get us started, there we go. I first got interested in rural school closure when I, as a teacher, I began my teaching career here in rural Bandler, Tennessee. I was a third grade teacher, and this was a school that was consistently threatened with closure. It was the smallest, ruralest school in the district, and it educated the district's poorest students. In the years before I arrived, it was known as a school where they sent the teachers they wanted to push towards retirement. And not surprisingly, it also had the worst test scores of any of the elementary schools in the district. When I arrived at the school, we were at this site, which was, you can see the brick buildings in the background there. It was a 100-year-old schoolhouse, and then also this kind of handful of trailers. The entire building was falling apart, and the septic was overflowing. I was out in one of those trailers, and in the trailers, the floor sagged. There was no computer. The AC often didn't work. And again, this was Tennessee, so that was pretty important. I could staple things directly into the wall of my classroom because they were so rotten. And there was one time where one of my students tripped and fell into the wall and actually left like a body-sized imprint in the wall, again, because they were so rotten. At the same time, this is a school where children felt seen and heard, where teachers taught their heart out, where the entire staff was doing so much with so little, and where the community would do just about anything to support it. But still at the district level, the question was always, should we spend the money to keep this school open? Eventually they decided to, and since then they've been able to continue to keep it open. But this threat, particularly when I was there, it created this anxiety that hung over the building that probably contributed to what was sometimes low morale in the building and those low test score numbers. And it certainly shaped decision-making at the district level. So this school was lucky. We got to keep our school, but other places aren't so lucky. And over the years since then, rural school closure has been a major part of my research and also a major part of my advocacy and organizing work. And I want to be really clear about this. I think that over the next few years, it's going to actually become even a larger part of my work because I think we're on the edge of an unprecedented wave of school closures. And I wish that wasn't the case, but I do think that's where we're at. And so we need to be realistic about that, and we need to be prepared for that. And we need to be ready to fight back. And so I'll turn towards that in just a bit here. So what do we know about school closures and their impacts? And most of what I'm presenting right now draws upon a review of the literature that I did with Trevor Aldridge Raveles that was looking at the research on both urban and rural school closures and particularly focusing on like what causes them and what are their impacts. So you might have read some of the recent headlines about mass closing in schools in cities all across the country. And perhaps it wasn't covered enough, but it got some coverage of these kind of mass closures, you know, in Oakland and in Chicago and in DC and in a whole bunch of other cities. But at the same time, much more quietly, there's also been a mass closing of rural schools. And this actually has been going on for about the past 150 years. So the first wave of closures came with industrialization and urbanization and the exodus of cities to cities in the mid to late 1800s. The second big wave of rural school closures that we saw came with desegregation, and those were predominantly Black schools that were closed during desegregation as districts figured out how to integrate and did so at the expense of Black communities. But then also during this period, there's just been this kind of steady trickle of closures, and a lot of these are rural closures. So what do we actually know about closures? So in terms of the motivation for them, and I'm not saying that this motivation is always accurate, but I'm saying like, you know, what are the justifications usually given? So the first big one is cost efficiency. So when it comes to urban schools, this is also often talking about right sizing urban schools. When we hear it about rural schools, it's often about maximizing efficiency. So trying to get the most for your money, with kind of the assumption that rural schools are often inefficient because they're so small. The second big rationale often given is academic performance. And this was particularly big during the Standards and Accountability movement with No Child Left Behind and in the years since then. And this is an effort to close failing schools to create accountability. And there's a number of assumptions packed in here. Number one being that there are better schools for students to attend, which is often not accurate. And also number two, that the threat of closure will somehow inspire better teaching, which is also often not accurate because teachers are usually doing exactly what they know how to do. Then the third rationale often given is equality. And so we often hear this in language like we're trying to equalize access to academic and extracurricular opportunities, particularly for marginalized students. And so thus we will close schools and send them to schools that have more or better academic and extracurricular opportunities. Also some assumptions packed in there, particularly around extracurriculars and whether or not students will be able to access them at their new school. So those are the motivations, and this has led to a whole bunch of policy mechanisms that lead directly and indirectly to closure. And there's also some other kinds of causes here too. So the more direct causes are things like federal and state accountability policies. This led to a lot of the academic or like the kind of the failure closures. And then sometimes district strategic plans will lead to closure as well. The more indirect causes, and we see a lot of these more prevalent for rural closures. So probably the number one cause is consolidation policies. And so district consolidation is where you consolidate, basically you merge together two smaller districts to make a larger district. What this usually does is it leads to school closure because the smaller district becomes a minority voice on the new school board, and so they cannot vote to keep their school open, and then in the name of efficiency, the schools get closed. Another big rationale here, another big cause is unfunded mandates. So this might be something coming down from a state, which could be like, raising teacher pay, which sounds great. But if it's not actually funded, it means that districts have to take on the costs that come with that. And so then they get even more and more cash strapped. So they look to cut money or cut spending anywhere they can, they close schools. Also, I think some of what's going to be contributing to closures in these next few years is the end of COVID money. And this might have been money that just kind of kept a school open a little bit longer than we might have expected without it, because the more direct cause here is dropping public school enrollments. And so, I mean, first, any place that has dropping enrollment and, for any variety of reasons. So in a rural area, this might be, the factory closed. And so there's not as many jobs, so families are leaving. Or with the mechanization of agriculture, there's not as many jobs, and so people are leaving. So that can drop enrollments, which can lead to closure. But also we know that just around the pandemic, public school enrollment has not returned to pre-COVID levels. And so this, I think right now is one of the major motivations that's going to be causing some closures. And then there's also just the privatization of public education. And this looks different in different places. So the rise of charter schools, the presence of school vouchers, even just the presence of private schools. In many of the places that I work, there's a private school that has siphoned off basically usually white children from the district, and which drops enrollments and then leads to some of the same pressures that I've just been talking about. And I think this is another mechanism that could be contributing to closures that we'll see in the next few years. What do we know about the implementation of closures? So first, there are often very few opportunities for genuine community input. So communities tend to feel like closure is something that happens to them rather than happens with them. And then sometimes there are opportunities for like forum and things like that. But community members often feel like those are not actually genuine opportunities for communication. The decision has already been made to close. And so this is kind of pro forma. We also know that oftentimes there are inconsistent criteria that come with closure. So there might be certain, academic criteria or certain standards for closures, and those are inconsistently applied. And so what this often leads to is wealthier districts or whiter districts being able to stay open, where districts serving poorer students or more students of color are forced to close. And then what the literature shows, and I have also often see, is that community members feel like their schools were set up to fail. And so, yes, they might be quote unquote failing, and I've got some issues with that terminology, but they might be failing in terms of their test scores, but they were actually underfunded to begin with. And so there was no possible way that they ever could have been successful. And so they're actually being punished for a crime that really isn't there. They're punished for a crime they didn't commit. Reactions to closures. So certainly there are some places and some students and some families and often administrators that support closure. But what we see is usually there's a lot of opposition to closure. And this is for a whole host of reasons. And, they vary, of course, depending on the particular community, but increased travel time. So it is not uncommon to see kids in the bus for 4 hours a day. Also, often the travel can be really unsafe. So you might have students going through, on buses, going through like tiny mountain passes. And actually, Kim and Kathy, where y'all are in West Virginia, this is, some of the unsafest bus routes in the country. And so if the kids are on buses for longer, there's increased risks there. Also, there might be opposition due to a loss of relationships, both with teachers and with peers, the loss of a really important community institution. So schools do all kinds of things aside from just educate the children. They are a source of jobs. They are a social center for a community. They are a source of political power. And so if you lose your school, you lose all of that. And then also many people oppose because they feel like it's this erosion of direct democracy. Again, closures happening to them rather than with them. So the distribution. So closure, both rural and urban, closure tends to affect places that are losing population, that have large local or state deficits, and that have rising tax rates. And so, the tax rate might be going up, and people feel like they're unable to pay that or to support that. Also, it's really important to know that the research shows that these closures disproportionately impact low-income communities and communities of color. So, this reform, while it's often framed in racially and economically neutral terms, has these racially and economically disproportionate consequences. And then what do we know about the effects? So first thing I'll just say is actually the literature here is pretty sparse. There's not really good literature, not really good research on what the effects of closures are. And I was kind of surprised by how limited the post hoc studies of closures are. So, people might promise all kinds of things leading up to closure, but then do we actually know that those things happened afterwards? And again, there's just not much. What we do see is around academic performance. We often see negative short-term impacts. So test scores can fall in sort of the meantime, and actually test scores seem to fall even the year before closure, not only the year after closure. And things like graduation rates might also be impacted. Long term, we see that test scores can rise, but only if kids are sent to a stronger school. And oftentimes students aren't, which is kind of ironic given those academic motivations for closing schools. Also, there's been some recent research out that indicates that even if test scores recover or rise, experiencing a closure can lead to longer term impacts on college degrees, employment, and earnings. So we see longer term reductions in all of those. So that's just like the academic piece of things. What we think in terms of social impacts, as mentioned before, yes, closures can often lead to longer and more dangerous school travel, negative emotional impacts, again, for all those kind of relational reasons cited before. Kids lose relationships. Oftentimes all of the children are not sent to the same school. This is called starbursting. So the kids might be starburst out. And so they lose friendships, they lose relationships with teachers. Also, there's just the stress of closure and the stress of the uncertainty around closure, which has its own kind of negative emotional impacts. And then we often can also see less parental and extracurricular involvement. So parents are not able to get back to the school, at night in order to attend the parent-teacher conference because it's that much farther away. And then extracurricularly, so, ironically, students might be going to a school that has a football team or it has a band, but they can't stay for football or band because they can't get back home afterwards because there's no one to take them home and they now live an hour from the school. So even if, the closure is sort of motivated by more extracurriculars, they may or may not be able to actually take advantage of those. And of course, that you can see how that would have a disproportionate impact on low-income kids. In terms of the cost effects, again, the research here is super limited, but what we find is that oftentimes the savings are really not that much. I'm working with the district right now in West Virginia, and it's estimated the savings of closing their school amounts to less than 1% of the district's budget. So they are really, really small. And this is because oftentimes you're not cutting teachers. And so teacher salaries are the biggest line item in a district's budget. And transportation costs are going way up. And so it really doesn't save as much money as it's often imagined that it would. And then there's this whole area of community effects. It's important to recognize that when people are talking about closure, these community impacts are often not taken into account. So it's really important to consider these as well. There is some indication of increased rural outmigration and economic decline because of the closure. This is a little bit difficult to tease apart because oftentimes it's outmigration and economic decline that precede a closure, but we seem to also see this kind of effect afterwards as well. And then just the loss of a really important community institution. As I mentioned, schools play all these important functions and roles in rural communities. And so if you lose your school, you lose all of that. And so I've begun to think about closure as a source of spatial injustice. So we know that resources are unevenly spread across geography, and schools increasingly are one of that, and one of those inequalities across geography. And that has a really important impact. And in many ways, I actually think it's kind of akin to redlining, because we know that it disproportionately affects poor communities and communities of color. It marks a community. No one wants, and I've heard this from many businesses, no one wants to invest in a place that loses its school. And initial evidence suggests that it contributes to educational decline, or at least a decrease in access, and also possibly economic decline and population decline as well. So that's kind of what we know from the literature right now. And then I want to just touch really briefly on some of the work that I'm doing currently before I turn to the toolkit. So this issue of community impacts has led to my current, one of my current research projects, which is looking at how school closures are shaping predominantly Black communities in the Arkansas Delta. And there's very little research on this topic. As I mentioned, there's just not much research in general on the effects, and this kind of racial disproportionality, particularly in rural communities, is pretty understudied. So just a bit on the Arkansas context, because that's where I'm focused. I'm sure I don't need to tell many of y'all, but it's an area with, like a lot of states, southern states in particular, there's a very fraught racial history of schools. So in the 1800s and 1950s, we saw underfunded segregated schools. In 57, FABUS, of course, blocked Little Rock 9 from integrating Central High School. Widespread desegregation didn't happen until the 70s. But as in across the country, we've started to see a gradual resegregation of schools that really began around 1988. 1988 is sort of when we hit the high water mark in terms of school integration, and we've been slowly resegregating since then. And Arkansas is no different. And then it also is a state that has a lot of private schools that are really affecting enrollment. And now that there's a voucher program in place, I think will probably become even more prominent. And many of these are segregation academies. So schools that were formed in the wake of desegregation, particularly to resist desegregation. And they were established for the education of white children. It's also a state that has several paths to school closure. So until recently, it had a forced consolidation law, which forced districts to consolidate if they had less than 350 students, and that led to a whole bunch of closures. That act has changed a bit recently, but there are still a number of other paths. So in Arkansas, if you are in academic, fiscal, or facilities distress for a number of years, that can lead to closure as well. Also, Arkansas just passed this LEARNS Act, which expanded access to school vouchers and charter schools. So that is likely, I think, going to have an effect in the next few years. I'm looking at three communities in the Arkansas Delta. So Hughes, which is about 1,300 residents, about 75% Black, its schools closed in 2016. Elaine, about 500 residents, 60% Black, schools closed in 2006. Dermot has about 2,500 residents, about 75% Black, and the schools are still open there, but closure is a threat. And I wanted to look at how just the threat of closure matters. And I should note here, Hughes is the blue one, Elaine is the red one, and Dermot is the green pin there. And the other thing to note too is those are the demographics of the area as a whole, but the school demographics before closure or currently are it's like about 99% Black in terms of the school demographics. All of the communities are agricultural. All of them are losing population with low median income and high poverty rates. So this is research that's ongoing. I'm actually headed down to Arkansas next week. But what I'm beginning to find is that school closure is both a cause and an effect of economic and population decline. So this is, an agricultural area. The mechanization of agriculture has led to a real decrease in the number of jobs, has led to outmigration, and so that has led to school closures in terms of dropping enrollments, but it also seems to follow school closure. So when the schools close, families move in order to be closer to the places their kids are going to school, especially because many of them also are not working in those communities. Also, we see the closure of businesses. So schools, they're often the largest employer in a rural district, but they also support all kinds of other small businesses. So, when school gets out, the local diner fills up, or the buses are serviced at the local gas station. So when you don't have a school there, those little businesses also close. We also see that school closure is loss of a social center. So people gather at the school, and when that's gone, they lose that. I also heard a lot about people talking kind of what it means symbolically to lose a school. And it's you're losing a point of pride and a sense of hope. And then also because many of the schools are, they've got Black administrators or they have a Black school board, when the school goes, you lose all of that leadership opportunities as well. And this is particularly important in places where the town is still very much controlled by white interests. So white folks own the land, they run the banks, they often occupy many of the other political offices. And so with closure, then you're losing this source of Black leadership. Or this outlet, I guess, for Black leadership. We also see that closure seems to have the largest impacts on the poorest families, especially those without transportation, because they're the ones that, when their kid falls sick in the middle of the day, they can't actually get to their kid to be able to pick them up. So disproportionate impacts there. The other thing I've really heard a lot about is how when there was a school in the community, raising the children was a community enterprise. It was a community endeavor. It wasn't uncommon for a kid to like mess up at school, go home and see their teachers sitting at their kitchen table. And without the school being right there in the community, you can't do that in the same way anymore. And so that's been a real loss with closure. Also, I hear a lot of residents talking about how school closure is experienced as just one more threat to Black economic and political power and community well-being and self-determination. It feels like a direct hit to the community and really to a thriving Black community in the Delta. But it's really important to recognize that communities are also resisting in all sorts of ways. So before closure, they're organizing to fight closure off. After closure, if it does happen, they're organizing to take back their closed buildings, and so continue to use those as a social and community center. And they're also organizing to help other communities resist closure and share their work and their expertise. So this last piece has really led me to think about what can we do to help communities resist closure, and particularly how this research might be able to contribute to that. So I've been working with the Rural Community Alliance, which is an organization in Arkansas. It works throughout the state. And they help support rural communities that are often fighting to keep their schools open. So working with them, we've created this website, which offers information about closure, as well as resources to fight it, and support for, if it comes to it, how to close well. And what is included in the website is it's based on existing research, but also research that I did with policymakers and administrators and community organizers who've been doing this work. So I think what I'm going to do now is stop sharing that, and I am going to, if you give me a second here, I am going to share the toolkit, and I encourage y'all to also go to it as well, so we can look at it together. Okay, let me share again. All right, are y'all able to see it now? Good. Okay. Um, so this is the website. Oh, and the other thing I'll just say here too is this is a work in progress. So I would love to hear any feedback for things to change or additional resources to include. I've been kind of doing this, like this has been sort of a labor of love for a variety of people. And so anything you suggest would be great. So I think the first thing I just want to note is that this website, this toolkit is especially meant for people that are affected by discriminatory school closures. So that is those closures that are forced upon low-income and Black and Brown rural communities. And this, to be clear, this resource is not for communities that are fighting closure in an effort to either hoard resources or avoid desegregation. I know that happens out there. And honestly, those communities don't need a resource anyhow because they're paying for lawyers and stuff like that. And so this is really for those that are fighting discriminatory closures. And so there's kind of a few big things here that I want to show. So the first is understanding closure, and I've mainly just talked through a lot of this, so I won't spend a lot of time on this now, but this gives a lot of background about what we know about closure. It goes through the literature, it sort of talks about what the impacts are, how it happens, why it happens, the kind of motivations that I just ran through, who it affects. And to that end, I've got a map here that looks specifically at the closures in Arkansas. And it has kind of a time-lapse thing on there that can show you where the closures happen. You can see what the effects were across the state. And then it looks a lot here on what closure does, and it links to some of the recent research. So that's all right there. And so if you're using this, and I encourage you to, then you've got the kind of documentation you would need in order to be able to make your case there. And then again, it also links to the article I mentioned earlier that has all of this research. It's very wonky, but it has all this research in one place right there. And then so the next tab here is fighting closure. And this is a place that has the recommendations, the tools, the tactics, the strategies for how to fight and hopefully resist closure. Some of these, this is designed to be kind of, I put everything here. So some of these might be more appropriate for school leaders, others might be maybe for community members, but it's all here in one place, so everyone's got access to everything. These are strategies that have been recommended to me by people that have done this work before, or who have been in consultation with those who have successfully fought it out. I think it's really important to know that in order for these kind of tactics to work, what you're doing is you're organizing. So you've got to have a really good organizing strategy behind all of this work. If you're kind of going in alone, chances are you're not going to be able to stave off closure. And so by organizing, what I mean is like building relationships, establishing leaders, mutual accountability, and mobilizing people to create change. I think to that last point, you've really got to start early on this kind of work. And I can't tell you how often I've heard from communities like, we just didn't think it was going to happen to us. We just didn't think it was any way that our school was going to be closed. And you are in a much better position to fight off closure if you're looking like 5-10 years out, rather than like, the school board is meeting to possibly close our school next week. So I encourage you to be taking that long-term perspective. So here's a whole list of tactics, and they're organized around kind of different areas. And some of the later ones are like, filing a lawsuit. That's like the last case resort, right? And persuading the State Board of Education. Some of the stuff here at the beginning are the things you'd want to do at the beginning. And so I won't go through all of these, but just to kind of give you a sense for what's here. So first, you'll need to understand the issue. So doing the research, collecting information to find out what policy. So, closure is caused by all sorts of different policies and all sorts of different issues. So you need to figure out like what's actually happening in your district so you can appropriately target that. Understand when the closure could happen. Figuring out who's responsible for the decision. So is this something that's going to be left up to the school board? In some states, it might go to a popular vote. In other states, it's going to be a state decision. So you've got to know who you need to persuade, how to reach those decision makers. And then you got to know, again, what the research says about the effects of closure. And that's where you go back to that first page. Then you need to think about developing a plan, how to target your efforts, really thinking about, there's probably a local fight that needs to be happening and then something at a more statewide level. And so figuring out what are those two levels, what are the particular things you need to really be doing there, and then knowing who to target in your organizing efforts. Acting early, as I've said that, understanding the opposition. So who's invested in closing the school and why? And so knowing, basically understanding the opposition, knowing the kind of case you need to make. And then making sure that you're coordinating community and school efforts. So you're most effective if you're able to do this working with school personnel and the school folks and also the community folks. And this might be like Chamber of Commerce, council members, religious leader, all of those people. This can't just be something that is limited to the school community. It's got to be something that is much more more widely felt. And then, so there's, a whole bunch more here in terms of like each one of these has a drop-down menu about what you need to be thinking about. A couple just I want to say here. So using research effectively. So I've got a lot of that research here. And so you can use that. I've also shared like several PowerPoints and there's a couple like research briefs and things that you might find useful. One thing I do think, as one researcher told me, if anything's going to happen, it's not because some pinhead with a PhD comes in with some nice tables and graphs and persuades the state that this is harmful. I love that quote because I think it's really true. And so you really need to be thinking about like, no one's going to be persuaded by the research. I mean, not no one, but like you need to be able to make it local. And so I think this is where really thinking about like what are the local effects and do your research there. So go and talk to the local business owners, go and talk to the person that's going to say like the diner owner who is like, yep, every day I get 100 customers, 75 of them come with a 3 p.m. rush when school closes out. And so if this school closes, I think this diner is going to close. And so you really need to be able to to document that. So look at the local economic impacts. I think this is also particularly persuasive because the rationale often given for closing schools is it saves money. And so if you can really frame it in terms of economic, like kind of the broader economic context, that can be persuasive sometimes in a way that other arguments might not. And this is a point that I make somewhere else in this website is that you really need to be thinking about like, what are the arguments that the opposition is giving and how do you frame your arguments in a way that's going to be persuasive to them? So you're going to have different messages for who you need to persuade, but it's really about targeting, targeting those different stakeholders. And so these are all the kind of other local impacts I would think about. Then there's also some recommendations around some of the more macro level things. So the number one cause of closure is fiscal strangulation. So that's starving a district of the funds it needs. And so you really need to think about how do you cut costs and increase revenue. And that's a hard thing. And that takes a lot of a lot of organizational work. And so things like sharing resources, adopting multi-grade classrooms, virtual education. And I would really think about how to do this well, because I think if parents feel like their kids are getting a second-rate education, that is not going to help your case at all. And I mean, honestly, why have a school if you're offering a second-rate education? But using virtual education in a way that supplements rather than replaces parts of your curriculum, I think can be useful. Some have experimented with a 4-day week. I would be cautious there just because I think the effects are going to be kind of mixed. Investigating, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in just a second, but investigating your state's funding formula. This is where a lot of the root of the issue is. And so there might be some policy changes you need to look at there. And then raising the tax rate locally, making short-term sacrifices. This only works for the extreme short-term. So asking staff to cut cut salary or give up, paid vacation or something like that, you cannot sustain that for long. Boosting enrollment is kind of the other side of this. That increases revenue. So how might you do that? There are some strategies there as well. Focus on academic quality, I think, is really important because it's much harder to shut down, like both kind of philosophically and logistically, it's harder to shut down a thriving school. And then the one other one I want to just call out here is changing policy. And so this is more of the long game. You know, if policies do not change overnight. And so if your school is on the chopping block right now, changing policy is not necessarily going to help. But if you're able to organize effectively across an area or across a state, you all need to really be thinking about like what are the policy level, like what are the policy issues that are causing these possible closures, and how do you change those? And so pushing to change your state's funding formula is a huge one. Some states, but not all, offer additional funding to small, rural, geographically isolated and or poor schools and districts. So if you are in a state that does not have that, I think that's one really important area to explore for change. There also might be things like state ballot measures. And then there's, I think, stuff around how to make the school closure process more transparent, more collaborative, with more community input. Definitely going to need a statewide coalition on this. One district doing alone is not going to help, but if you're able to create these statewide coalitions, that's much more impactful on that state level. Yeah, and then of course, like, you know, filing a lawsuit is kind of a last ditch effort there. Two more things I just want to share quickly, and then we'll turn towards discussion. So there's also a page here for closing well. So sometimes like the pressure just gets so great that it is impossible to stay open. And so how do you actually, if you need to close, particularly if you're feeling like you're not able to offer that strong education anymore, how do you close well? And so I think letting the voters decide is a big piece of this, so that it feels like it's a community decision. Making sure there's lots of opportunities for input in the decision. This is, and I don't mean like just having the vote. I mean like opportunities for public discussion and debate, and you know, crafting plans together, that kind of thing. Community members who might be about to experience a closure need to ask really hard questions of their leadership. And I list some of those there. And these, you know, um, vary from, you know, basically where my children are going to go to school. Are all kids going to be going to the same school, or are they going to be going to different schools? What will transportation look like? Will transportation cover after school activities? But then also questions that teachers and staff might have. What support it's going to be given? How will supplies be moved from the closed school to the open school? Once the decision is made, school members should be really transparent about how the decision was arrived at. Then closure needs to be something that's really planned for. And, you know, there needs to be all kinds of opportunities to make sure that disruption for students and for community is really going to be minimized. And also, you know, there might be ways to honor the closed school, and so engaging in closing rituals. One school I talked to, they had a time capsule that was really important for closing things out for the students. Thinking about what a successful closure would look like, so that you can then hold yourself to that standard and plan for that. I think maybe the biggest one is really thinking about the receiving school as a new school. And this is one where you sometimes get pushback. But I think to the extent to which you can really think about this, the school that is receiving all the children is not just the receiving school, but it's also an entirely new school. So having kids vote on the color and the mascots, giving students and families opportunities to come together to envision the new school. And then really doing the hard work to integrate students. You know, how are you going to help them anticipate the closure, get ready for going to the new school? What kind of community festivals might you hold that bring people together across community lines? All of those kinds of things. I think it's also really important to help teachers and guidance counselors to coach them to be listening carefully for instances of bullying based on, you know, home community. And so students get the message that this kind of place-based exclusion isn't tolerated. Making sure that teachers' needs and concerns are addressed, clear communication. And then really thinking about what to do with the school buildings. I've heard some really telling, quite awful stories about what the school buildings went towards when they just were left in the hands of a couple powerful individuals in a community. So how do you ensure that the school buildings remain a community resource rather than just kind kind of a, a plaything of one or two people. And different states have different laws in terms of like kind of who the building goes to automatically. And so knowing those regulations and being able to navigate that is really critical. And then the final thing I just want to show here is the resource page. And so this is just some kind of ancillary resources that might be useful. Again, the link to that paper that I mentioned. This is an older series that ran in the Charleston Gazette Mail on the cost of closure in West Virginia in the early 2000s. So it's old, but it is amazing how relevant it continues to be. Ed Week has also been publishing some stories on like kind of the current state of closures. So there's some good ones there. And then here are some talking points on the effects of closure, which I think might be useful in school board meetings and those kinds of things. Some organizations doing this work. This is Rural Community Alliance, who I developed this resource in collaboration with. Some more general information about community organizing, some more briefs and presentations that might be useful. And then a variety of other resources for strong rural schools that might just be useful to think about in terms of supporting like, academics in rural areas, or how to do a lot with amazingly few resources. All right, so that is the website. I think I will stop sharing. And as I said, this has been a labor of love. It's a work in progress, and I'd love to hear like questions, but any thoughts you have in terms of what might be useful there, or anything else, any reactions.
Hey, thanks, Mara. That was great. And I do see a lot of value in that website. There's just a lot of really relevant information. So if you would maybe start, do you want to use chat?
You can either use chat
Or
or just
raise your hand.
or we'll just keep an eye on the screen, or and flag for you, Mara, if there's someone, or just unmute yourself and pose a question or comment or whatever. John, wonderful to see you. You have the floor.
Good to see you all. Mara, you mentioned earlier about pressures on possible an increase in closures. Is there something timely you're referring to? Is it related to the election at all? Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so mainly I was worried about this pre-election, and this relates to dropping public school enrollment. We haven't rebounded to post-closure or pre-closure levels in terms of public school enrollment. I also think that with the money that came with COVID relief funds was really great and useful, but that's dried up now. And so I think maybe schools that could have, that hung on for a few additional years because they had that funding, now we're going to see the effects with that funding removed. Then there is the push towards the privatization of public education. And so by that, I mean, rise in charter schools and also school vouchers. And so that was going on before the election. But with how the election panned out, I anticipate that we'll see even more of that in the coming years. So that's what's leading me to anticipate even more of those. And, like Ed Week has been covering as well, we are looking right now, we're starting to see kind of an uptick in closures. And then of course, so there's a privatization of education that might come with the current administration or the incoming administration. But then also if any kind of federal funding for schools is cut, particularly Title I funding, which goes for predominantly low-income schools, I think that would be another pressure that could increase closures in the coming years.
Sure, and obviously it'd be difficult, but if they were to close the department, you close the REAP program, you close a number of other programs.
Exactly. And so, what happens to all of those programs? And yeah, so I mean, we're kind of reading tea leaves at this point, but I think there's been some indications that, again, make me more anxious right now. And I'd been pretty anxious before about this issue.
Understood. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Hey, Mara, you talked about the fact that it's important for people to try to get ahead of this.
Mhm.
That by the time the threat is imminent, there's not much time left to organize. Could you talk to us just a little bit about it's hard to create a conversation when there isn't a threat. So
Yeah.
can you talk to us about what would you do in a community that might not be facing threat, but could be just around the corner, you just don't know yet? What kind of conversations would you recommend people be having?
That is a great question. So, I mean, I guess I think a couple different things. I think it's easier for school officials to be able to both be aware of the fact that this might be coming in a way that, those of us that are just, out in the community might not. So if they're looking at enrollment numbers and they've seen kind of a steady decline over the years, that would be one indication that, even if right now we don't look super small, like, let's look at what's happening here. So I think school officials might be better positioned to both know that this is an imminent threat and also start some of the conversations. And this might be in times of, in terms of like, we're developing our 5-year plan or a 10-year plan. And so then that can lead to this conversation. And then what I would, hope that administrator would do would be not just have the conversation within the safety of their school board, but really be broadening it out into the community. If this is some kind of 5-year or 10-year planning process, let's talk about this, this possible issue as a part of that process. In terms of just, let's say we got, the parent or the organizer who's thinking about this. I mean, I think this is what the work of organizing is one-on-one conversations, making it matter, talking to, well, right now you've got a 1-year-old, but in 5 years, you're gonna have a 6-year-old and they are going to be a first grader. And so, what's it going to mean if you don't have a school for your first grader to go to? I think if you can put it into really personal terms for people, that helps. And what those personal terms are going to be is really going to differ depending on who the person is. And so, is it the business owner that wants to ensure that other businesses want to invest in the community? Well, if you don't have a school here, it's going to be hard to attract other businesses to your town. Is it the person that's in their 70s paying taxes and is worried about high tax rates? Well, you need to think about like, all the services that you enjoy in this community, who's going to provide those? And if there's no school here, we tend to see school closure going along with things like hospital closure. And so I think trying to broaden the conversation out from just one about schools to about like larger community well-being and how schools play a role in that. Like, I think that can be an entry point. And a lot of this done in the hopes of, or with the intention of, let's have a larger conversation about who we are as a community and where we want to be in 5, 10, 15 years. I mean, the other thing too is that usually the things that lead to school closure, you're feeling these pressures in other ways, right? Because it's, it's also coupled with outmigration. And this is not always the case, but it's often coupled with outmigration. It's also coupled with, the last mill just closed. And so linking all of those issues together and having hard conversations about economic well-being, about community well-being, about public health, I think is critical.
Mara, we had a question that got dropped into chat from Montana. I'll read it for you too, and so the group can see it. Thank you for all of the powerful information that is also useful. I live, work, and reside in Western Montana. Our very rural state is under fire for closures and for compacting schools. The impact has been less than positive. I like the red line comparison. We are seeing that here, less due to race and more due to class. Could you go over that comparison again?
Yeah. And so we do see closures seem to disproportionately impact. And again, the research here is better in when we're looking at closures in cities than in rural areas. This has just been less investigated in rural areas. But we do seem to in research that indicates that closures disproportionately impact low-income communities and communities of color. And so, and what we also know is that when schools close, there seems to be a lot of evidence that it leads to all these other kind of downstream community effects in terms of like closure of businesses, less political power, increased outmigration, because, you know, if you are living in rural Elaine, Arkansas, and you know, oftentimes the only reason you're still staying in Elaine, Arkansas is because your kids go to school there. So the school closes, and you're already working outside of the community. You already grocery shop outside of the community. What's keeping you in that place? And so all these kinds of effects are sort of tied together. And so, you know, what it means is that often when a school goes, businesses don't want to invest in that community. And I mean, I hear so often from business owners that like we can't attract businesses to this area in part because we don't have a school anymore. And so, I mean, it always amazes me when I hear policymakers talk about like rural revitalization, how do we, you know, create strong, thriving rural communities, and then they're talking about policies that lead to closure. Like that's absolutely contradictory. And so, so yeah, so I think there is this kind of redlining effect, and you know, plays out in all different kinds of ways, but you know, there is a disproportionate impact. And in that map in Arkansas too, I don't have the data up there, but we saw that with Act 60, which was this consolidation law, there was a disproportionate impact on low-income communities. And so I'm not surprised to hear about the fact that, you know, they're seeing the impact on, you know, with combining districts, compacting schools, you're seeing the impact on low-income communities in particular.
Is there one last question or comment? And otherwise, Mara, we know that you have to run and teach class, so we don't want to be the ones to keep you late. We have one more comment that just came into chat. I am in Randolph County, West Virginia. The Randolph County Schools is currently looking at closing 2 12-year schools and 1 elementary K-5 school. These schools are in the most rural parts of the community or county. The community is up in arms right now. The school superintendent has informed the public that this is due to drop in enrollment numbers and funding. There is a meeting at one of the schools today to hear public input. My friend is on the school board, is dealing with angry students and parents. I'm going to direct my friend to the section on how to close well to help her with her position in this situation. It's not looking like the schools are not going to close as of now.
Yeah. I mean, I hope the resource is useful. I mean, school boards are in a hard position. I mean, I think one important thing to just remember is that closing schools often does not save all that much money.
Right.
And so really making sure that, you know, you've kind of really run the numbers, because, you know, it sounds like it's all about, you know, it sounds efficient, but it's often not. Or it might not be in light of the kind of larger costs. But yeah, my heart goes out to anybody who's navigating this right now.
Okay. Well, we're going to close. So first, we're going to say, Mara, a massive thank you for sharing all of this, for taking time out of your day to be with us, squeezing this in. We want to say a huge thank you to all of you for joining and for your questions. Mara, if you're comfortable with it, we will get the slides from you and send them out to the group along with a recording of the session, or at the very least, you'll have the recording of the session. Mara has also just dropped her email into chat if you need to reach her. And of course, we will also send out the link to the website again. If you're able to, we would love for you to join us next time. Our next in the series will be Thursday, December 12th at 1:30 p.m. And we will be joined by Amanda Bastoni, who's the Director of Career Tech and Adult Education for CAST, along with Andrew Coppins and Jason Seaman. Andrew is the Associate Professor of Education at the University of New Hampshire, and Jason is the Department Chair for the Recreation Management and Policy Program at University of New Hampshire. And the topic they're going to be sharing is STEM Pathways for Rural Youth, Developing STEM Identity and Community Engagement Through the Outdoors. And they'll be sharing the results of this incredibly exciting and super successful pilot project they've been doing with rural young people in far northern New Hampshire, engaging the community, the school districts, and working with young people themselves of how to use outdoors to build social capital for young people and connect them to STEM. So we hope you can join us. Last but not least, I want to say a giant thank you to Chloe Seaton, who is hiding behind the scenes on this. We will call Chloe our creative manager for the moment, keeping us on the rails, but she helped make sure that the outreach for this learning series and this webinar was successful behind the scenes. So giant thank you to Chloe. I'm Kim Finney.
Kathy Moxon. Until next time, from
Yes.
Rural Youth
Catalyst,
Catalyst.
that is who we are. Massive thank you to you all.